Hello everybody. This is a rather unusual way to communicate, and indeed, the topic I'll talk about reflects the current times we're in, which is essentially what are the lessons we can learn from the responses by states and populations to the current COVID-19 pandemic, and what could be learned, particularly in relation to some of the habits that people have got into, um, the ways in which we can now, as citizens, see that things that were often said to be impossible, such as government, helping ordinary citizens through economic crises, considerations of mortgage, holidays, the renationalisation of sections of the private healthcare system, as in Spain, and so on. All of these things are now up for grabs. It seems we're in an extraordinary moment, which obviously is going to result in quite a lot of human suffering and death. Let's not forget that. But the point I'd like to raise in my comments are what are the positives that could be taken in terms of the responses to this crisis, particularly in relation to, as I say, the habits that citizens perhaps have developed, particularly in view of what states can do, but also the powers states now have demonstrated that they do possess, and they're not as powerless against market forces or business as usual as many of us tend to think that they are, and particularly the importance of these habits by citizens, new ways of living enforced on many of these are, but also what states can do, particularly to help us to move with the same emergency measures and determination on the much bigger crisis that we face, bad and all as the pandemic will be. And we don't know how long that's going to last. It could be 6 months, it could be a year, it could be 18 months. The destruction wrought by this crisis, I think, will and does pale into insignificance when compared to the already huge numbers of people who are suffering and dying and will suffer and die as a result of the climate and ecological emergency. So, in a way, that's what I want to talk about. What are the lessons that can be learned, and in particular, that we don't simply return to the status quo ante once the crisis is over. I think this is a generational defining moment that we're in, to see that we can create a better society if we all pull together with determination. And in particular, it's interesting to note that we've had the declarations of climate and ecological emergencies by many nation states, for example, the Irish Parliament, Westminster, France, the European Parliament as well, Belfast City Council, and many councils here in Northern Ireland and in England, Wales, Scotland, and the Republic have all declared these. But how would citizens know that they were living in a jurisdiction where a climate and ecological emergency has been declared? Well, in my view, what we're now experiencing with the coronavirus pandemic and responses, this is what an emergency looks like. What was once unthinkable or seen as beyond the pale is now not only possible but absolutely necessary, where as societies are now moving to displace other goals such as economic growth and so forth and competitiveness with the importance of getting resources to people, particularly via our healthcare systems, which of course I think have been shown to be populated with people of the utmost integrity and demonstrating degrees of diligence and humanity above and beyond the call of duty, but also how badly starved they've been for quite some time of the necessary resources due to austerity, particularly in the context of the National Healthcare Service in Britain and Northern Ireland. I'll read you out some quotes which in a way captures this extraordinary moment. Um, we have one from Boris Johnson: at all stages we have been guided by the science. Arlene Foster, the First Minister: we need to listen to what the science says. It's a war. That's a quote from an Italian medic. And then this extraordinary statement from the Irish Taoiseach Leo Varadkar. And he says, I know that I am asking people to make enormous sacrifices. We're doing it for each other. Together we can slow it in its tracks and push it back. And together as one nation, we can save many lives. And what's interesting about all of these is that imagine the same statements being applied to the climate and ecological emergency, that the likes of Boris Johnson and Arlene Foster are going to listen to what the science is telling us, and it's fairly clear. It's about reduction rapidly and at scale of carbon emissions and greenhouse gases, which would require shifting from private car transportation to public transportation as quickly as possible, divesting pension schemes from the fossil fuel industry and the planned retirement of that particular industry, because the continuation of fossil fuel exploration and that industry is simply incompatible with a climate stable world. Whereas we don't see the same determination when it comes to climate as we see now with the issue of the pandemic. And that's quite interesting to say the least. And again, I hope that populations and citizens living through this extraordinary moment remember this is what people and politics and the state can do when it acts in the context of an emergency, a real, clear and present danger that's a threat to our ways of life. And that indeed you could say there is a read across from the pandemic being focused on the preservation of human life and the public health emergency, to see that being extended now into the planetary health emergency that we're going to have to deal with fairly quickly. And the issue here is that why are politicians acting on the science, acting with such speed and determination on the COVID-19 crisis, and they haven't done anything remotely like this around the climate and ecological crisis, about which you've had science for the last 3 decades or more indicating that the problem is getting worse, indicating we need to divest from fossil fuels, we need to move away from a heavily carbonized food system, we need to start restructuring our economy in a more low carbon direction, and we haven't seen much by way of actual action, although quite a lot of rhetoric around these issues, particularly in terms of the declarations of climate and ecological emergencies, as I said earlier. My own view, and again it may be shared by others watching this, is that life will not be normal after this. This is a rule breaking, a paradigm shift moment in terms of how we as human beings in our different societies live, work, think about our views of the good life and what a good society is. All of these things I think are now up in the air at this moment as we face, hopefully with diligence and resilience and humanity, the threat that now faces many people around the world. You take for example what's happening in Italy. On the one hand, it now shares with China this extraordinary upside of the pandemic. Many of you may have seen that NASA took satellite photographs of China in terms of air pollution, particularly nitrous oxide, and showed that the comparison between December last year and January, February this year was like chalk and cheese. The earlier one was just smog as a result of the fossil fuel, largely coal fired industries and factories in China. But then as soon as the pandemic hit, obviously those factories couldn't continue as people were self-isolating and so on, and you begin to see the air clean. And actually there is some evidence to show that while the pandemic has certainly caused a loss of life in China and will do over the next couple of weeks, although it seems that China has now reached the peak and is coming down the other side, there is an upside in that probably more people will be saved as a result of air pollution levels decreasing. And this is coming out of a report from Stanford University. And the same thing has happened now in Italy, particularly northern Italy. as a result of the public health emergency. The economy has been put on hold, and air pollution has increased as a result of using less fossil fuels, not just in terms of industry, but also in car use and so on. And it's remarkable to think that it's taken a disaster like the pandemic to actually improve the ecological balance and the ecological quality and air quality of many people around the world. And it does give us pause to think, why should this only happen now in the context of a disaster rather than it being a planned and managed process of moving away from fossil fuels, as again the science has been telling us to do for many decades. And in many ways, the changes to the lives of citizens also gives an insight into what perhaps is going to be needed and should be needed as we make more determined action to do with climate, in terms of citizens have a greater appetite, I think, for radical action, such as what we're seeing around the world in many societies, than governments often outside of wartime actually give them credit for. That citizens are, so long as it's been explained what's going on in an open, transparent way, there's no egregious inequalities within whatever tough decision that the government is going to make, that populations can make radical changes very quickly. I mean, who amongst us listening in here tonight thought that 2 weeks ago this is how this talk was going to be? This was going to be a face-to-face standard talk at the university next Tuesday, and I certainly wasn't going to be talking about the COVID-19 pandemic and its connection with climate and ecological breakdown. And therefore we're in a very, very different position fairly quickly. And while we're still all adapting to these new ways of life, homeschooling, not going out as much, social distancing and so on, people are resilient. People are smart, they're not dumb. The crisis certainly has brought out the best in people in terms of communities coming together. Yeah, let's not forget that some of the aspects of the worst has come out as well. I can't for the life of me think why we may remember this moment as the bog roll crisis, in terms of suddenly people stripping our supermarkets of toilet rolls and pasta and dried goods and so on. And just on that point, it's quite interesting to note that, as far as I can make out from reading and watching the news on this issue, the same run and panic on food that we see in the UK and to a lesser extent Ireland wasn't witnessed in Italy, and certainly not in China. And what does that say about our societies? Does it indicate a lack of trust in government and corporations, particularly the five multiples? In case you didn't know, there are five multiples, major companies that control about 90% of the food supply in Britain in terms of supermarkets and so on. Is that what was going on there? Or is it that we now have become so individualized as societies that people felt that the only way they could protect themselves and their family was by each person for themselves? I'm sure anthropologists and sociologists would be analysing the response for years to come in terms of how different people reacted. But my own view is that on the whole, people have behaved responsibly, calmly, and also that the state has managed this crisis as best as it can, despite the underfunding of the NHS, despite, certainly here in Northern Ireland, considerable amounts of confusion around the closing of schools. And now the schools are closed, but are they going to be open for key workers? They have to have one member of the family as a key worker, or two, and so on. So I think really, if the RHI had indicated anything at all, and fair play to Sam McBride's book, if you've read it, Burned, by the RHI scandal, but certainly indicated the complete lack of competence of our political class and indeed our policymakers and civil servants. The crisis here in Northern Ireland hasn't also demonstrated confidence and leadership that we need, particularly a frightened population needs at this time. And one issue I think is quite important in terms of the connection between the the discourse around the pandemic and how this could be a salutary lesson for the climate and ecological emergency is how quickly the frame of flattening the curve has come into our popular understanding of how we should respond. You know, that we need to delay the peak, bring down that peak of how many people are going to be infected for as long as possible to enable our particularly cash starved and underinvested national healthcare system to be able to deal with it. And I do think that it has been intuitively appealing for people. They can understand why it is that they're social distancing, working from home, and so on, as part of a collective effort to flatten that curve, and particularly where it's very clear, and I think a good job has been done in terms of communicating, you know, the public's response and responsibility around this, is that it's not about the majority of the population not getting ill or in fact stopping the virus. We have no cure for it, but it's about, you know, extending when that peak will happen, flattening it out so that it's longer rather than shorter in time, and that really who we're protecting are our most vulnerable, our elderly, those with immunosuppressant conditions, respiratory problems, and so on. So this is about individual action in the service of others, and I think that also is something that has been quite remarkable to witness, and does give you hope in humanity that people can act in this other regarding manner. But I do think this flattening the curve logic or frame can actually also be used in the climate crisis. You know, if you look at any of the climate science, it's usually a series of projections of business as usual, of fossil fuel use going up and greenhouse gases and the Earth system becoming more and more unstable as we reach, you know, 1.5, 2 degree. And then other graphs showing as well, so this is what you have to do in terms of to get to net zero by 2050 or 2030. And I think the same argument should be used and presentation and visual imagery of communicating to citizens, this is how we rise up, understand and cope with and get beyond the climate crisis and deal with in terms of bending the curve down. If flattening the curve is the logic of the pandemic, bending the curve down has to be the logic and aim for societies and individuals in terms of meeting the challenge of the climate crisis. There's also another, you know, interesting dimensions of the pandemic that I think are relevant to dealing with the climate and ecological emergency. One is the mobilization of the society's assets and resources towards different ends than which they're currently configured to do. So the classic ones that stand out that may be familiar to people listening, you know, on the one hand, we desperately need ventilators. There's not enough ventilators to be able to deal with those who are going to get critically ill as a result of the virus. So therefore, there are many engineering firms who are currently making, you know, JCBs is one that has been mentioned, but the other engineering firms currently making different commodities that they need to be reconfigured to be able to make ventilators, which is what we need at this current moment. And there has been some, in my view, rather weak gestures in that direction by the UK government in appealing to engineering firms to consider making these ventilators, which stands in stark contrast to the more determined action of the Spanish government, who simply renationalised large swathes, if not all, of the private healthcare facilities in terms of expropriating and or reappropriating those resources to mobilise them in a very different direction than they were before. Or you can see in a more, I suppose, I'm not quite sure if it's PR or whether it's genuine, who's to know, but Louis Vuitton, you know, now no longer making perfumes and so on, but making hand sanitizers. And it does give you an indication that the resources are there to meet pressing human needs, whether they're dealing with the crisis in terms of the pandemic, or indeed you could say the low carbon technologies that we need. All that's missing is a determined action by the state, backed up by citizens who are demanding and supportive of this new way of doing things. And for me, I think there is quite a lot of positives that could be potentially seen in this crisis, and I completely understand people may feel that what I'm saying here is completely insensitive and inappropriate, given that we're still living, we're only at the beginning, certainly here in Northern Ireland, of what's going to happen. But I do think it is important that we see how we as societies, and particularly with the role of the state is more powerful than many of us had realised, and that actually its self-imposed limits under neoliberalism and a more market approach to how society should be organised, that now has been blown out of the water. It may be hyperbole and exaggerating, but I've seen reports on the internet and so on that it's certainly in Italy, and maybe perhaps you could say Spain, this has been the temporary suspension of capitalism. A temporary emergency motivated suspension of business as usual. And I think that has a lot of truth to it. Of course, the danger is that once the crisis is over, we return back to normal. That evictions, which are currently effectively outlawed in Ireland and other countries, will only last for 3 months, or how long the pandemic lasts, and so forth. That radical progressive ideas like universal basic income, in terms of giving people money, jobs guarantees, mortgage holidays, all of these radical ideas which we now see popping up all over the place, which in 2-3 weeks ago would be seen as crazy, kind of a Marxist utopia in some way, in terms of state intervention in the economy. These are now happening before our eyes, and that is a lesson that in the context of a crisis and emergency, it is not the free market that will save us. It's citizens and states acting together, and that to me has been the take home, or one of the many take home lessons of this, which we can use in terms of the climate crisis. But I do want to just to end on saying that to me, we're in a very hopeful moment. It is quite frightening, of course, as well. And by hope, I'm here using the term, the famous, sadly passed away Czech playwright and former president Václav Havel, who has a wonderful poem on hope. And in that poem, he says, hope is not the same as optimism. And many of us have this kind of naive view that somehow there'll be an app for that, or we'll solve many of our problems purely through kind of technological optimism. And again, I'm not a Luddite, we will need technology. But hope, as he defines it, is not the conviction that things are going to work out right. In other words, hope is active. You've got to struggle for hope, whereas optimism is more passive, where something it's going to happen, it's going to be good, the outcome is going to be okay. Either an expert or the state or a technology will solve it. But I think the issue is here that we live in hope, but that requires activism in terms of, generating that sense of a hopeful, progressive, alternative future that I think the pandemic has shown us is possible in the context of dealing with the climate and ecological crisis. Because to compare the kind of left progressive views of Havel with the right-winger Milton Friedman, who I also think is appropriate to quote at this stage, and some of you may be familiar with this quote, and it's about crisis. I'll just read it out. It says, "Only a crisis, real or perceived, produces real change. When the crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable." And I think now is the moment. Now is the moment to press home the idea that many of us perhaps have said over the years on marches and in discussions, but maybe didn't really believe it, that another world is possible. And we're beginning to see elements of it emerging in front of our eyes. It is a temporary window, brought about by the pandemic. And of course, the real danger is that window will close and there is a return simply to business as usual. Whereas what we need to do is to break business as usual, to see that what we need is a radical step change in how we organise societies and our economies. So for me, We live in very interesting times, to say the least. I think the pandemic, we will overcome it. We are a resilient species and people. But as I say, the real um, benefit of what's happening is not necessarily the improved air quality in China and Italy, not perhaps even the rediscovery of community and so on that people are now maybe experiencing as a result of staying at home and so on. Maybe getting to know the kids a bit better because they're now forced to work at home and their children are at home. All of those are good, don't get me wrong, but the real prize here is to see that the state has agency, that people have agency, and that things can be different if there's the political will to do so. So I hope everybody is observing appropriate social distancing, washing their hands while singing Happy Birthday twice or the Internationale, or there are other songs of your choice. I believe the sash is also being used. Stay safe, stay well, and stay connected. Thank you very much, and good night.